I think we're looking at the worst case scenario, Pete, and that's what let's take for example the new CEO of NAB. He's McEwen. He's obviously taking over a bank in trouble. He's looking at the implications of this threat of the coronavirus and the implications for the economy. Partly closed down, lockdowns everywhere. But we also know that, in fact, CNBC this morning actually has a picture of Bondi Beach on one of its headline stories, praising both Australia and New Zealand, as well as South Korea, for being the countries of the world who really have nailed the coronavirus better than other countries of the world. Now, if their scenario is right, and I've got to say, I'm talking to a few people who I respect who think that we're doing so well, that a lot of this lockdown and closure stuff could be over a lot quicker than was expected. And if that's the case, the worst case scenarios by the banks or by the banking analysts saying $35 billion worth of losses could well prove to be the worst case scenario when we're actually looking at the best case scenario. And so if I was a new CEO, why wouldn't you go for the worst case scenario? Raise $3 billion worth of capital like NAB has done, cut the dividend. But if things turn out to be a lot better in 6 months' time and 12 months' time, guess what? You're going to look like a genius. And that's the kind of thing you want people to think of you if you're a CEO of a major bank.
What about when it comes to dividends? I mean, NAB's cut about 60%, I think, roughly, off its dividends. I mean, is that going to be the same across the board?
I think the banks will kind of follow suit. By the way, there's a possibility that banks might cut their dividends to zero. So, McEwen actually just going from 84 cents down to 30 cents at least means that the other banks are not going to be so silly as to turn their dividends into zero. But let me say to you this, Pete. During the GFC, I remember CBA cut its dividend, but when it reinstated its usual dividend, they actually more than made up for the cut. And that was because Australia didn't go into a serious recession like most other countries of the world. People were predicting 10% unemployment. We didn't even make 6%. So as a consequence, the dividend quickly came back. And that's a distinct possibility in Australia that we could have 6 months to a year of lousy dividends for banks compared to their usual great dividends, but then there could be an enormous resurgence if the best case scenario, which it looks like it's playing out at the moment, actually comes to be true.
And despite all of that, I mean, generally the share market is moving forward into positive territory, despite the hit that the banks have had in the last couple of days.
Yeah, and that's a really good sign because the banks are critically important to the overall index. And it partly explains why our index is not doing as well as the S&P 500 in the US because, our banks and financial institutions take up nearly 30% of the index. So if they're, and by the way, remember, part of the rescue plan of the government has been to rely on the banks. So when you rely on the banks to defer loans and to provide loans at low interest rates, it clearly affects their profits. So there's an inextricable link to the coronavirus and bank profitability, dividends and whatever. But if the kinds of predictions that some economists are now making, suggesting that we come out of this a lot quicker than people were expecting. You remember, it was only 4 weeks ago the Treasurer and the Prime Minister were basically turning us into a Yogi Bear economy, in hibernation. Now, if this hibernation ends up being a 3-month affair rather than 6 months, you can chop in half all those scary predictions. And I know one really well-known economist who's saying that we might even avoid a technical recession.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so he's been courageous, but obviously his numbers have improved desperately as our economy improves. And by the way, only about, March 23, the Aussie dollar got down to 54 US cents. And that was a reflection of how scary, I think I might have mentioned it on the program then, we're nearly at 65 US cents, indicating that market sentiment's coming good.